Gavin Esler, thank you for joining us for Personality Politics.
Welcome. Yeah, looking forward to it.
So you grew up in Glasgow and then Edinburgh. You went on to be the first in your family to go to a university, I believe. An average middle-class upbringing, would you say?
Well, I was born into a council house in Clydebank at 66 Clarence Street with my grandmother, two aunties, my mother and father. And we lived there till I think I was about 5. And we then moved to Edinburgh. I lived in a council house in Edinburgh for a short time, but my father was upwardly mobile and he moved fairly definitively into the middle classes. He became a middle manager. So I don't know whether that's quite a normal middle class background. I think it was normal for the post-war aspirational family that I was born into.
It's funny, isn't it, us Brits? No one ever wants to admit to being middle class, even though I think probably 95% of us are these days. But I think you've given a good explanation why you might be less middle class than some.
John Prescott said we're all middle class, didn't he? I think it was John Prescott. So we're something like that.
So was politics discussed much in the house? Did your father or mother share any strong political views with you as kids?
Not particularly. I mean, my formative experiences were nearly dying at 3 weeks old. I was very ill and being saved by an NHS hospital, and my grandmother telling me, "You're lucky you were born now when the NHS was such a wonderful thing." So it was discussed in those terms. Obviously, I don't remember what it was like being 3 weeks old. But there was a great glorification of some of the things which were introduced in the 40s and 50s by successive governments, but particularly by the Labour government. So there was a bit of that. My parents were conservative, and not everybody in the family was. And then eventually at some point, there was one uncle who had lots and lots of uncles, who decided he was a member of the Scottish National Party. So he was sort of, at the time, regarded as a bit of an oddball. He was way out there.
So you went to Northern Ireland to begin your journalistic career. Does that mean you didn't vote in Westminster parties for traditional elections, because you then spent quite a bit of your career for a correspondent? Or were you voting by post?
No, I don't think I've ever voted by post. And I didn't vote in British elections. I voted in Northern Ireland elections at various points. And it was, at the time, there was an absolute alphabet soup of political parties. I remember if you looked at the party board in a general election in Britain, you tended to get Labour, the Conservatives, and Liberals or Lib Dems, or and so on. In Northern Ireland, the board was, despite only 1.5 million people, was so long. There were probably half a dozen varieties of Unionist Party, half a dozen Republican parties or nationalist parties, and so on. So it was very, very complicated. But it was a very, very divisive time, and it was very, very unpleasant in many ways. Although I did find, for instance, Harold McCusker, who was a Unionist MP for County Armagh, and Gerry Fitt, who was an SDLP, so a nationalist MP for West Belfast. I became quite close to both those guys, and they were both very, very decent people trying to do the best for their community and trying to not get anybody killed. So I formed a view that many people go into politics for the right reasons and are good people, but they tend to be pulled, or they can tend to be pulled to extremes. And why I liked Harold and Gerry was they didn't allow themselves to be pulled to extremes. Even when Gerry Fitt had a mob coming into his house one night, and he had to defend himself with a gun, which he had legally held.
You were reporting on the Troubles, possibly the most bloodiest, intense period of the mid-70s. Funny, if I cut my teeth in journalism in Belfast as well, but in the latter end of the Troubles. It must have been hard, though, when you're reporting on such bloodshed, not to form sympathies with one side or the other, even if it's only on certain incidents.
Yeah, well, I mean, to give you an example, my family I've got a family in Northern Ireland, Protestant, Unionist, small U Unionist. And of course, I had sympathies with them. And I did not think, and I still don't think, it's a good way to unite a country by blowing part of it up. So I didn't have much sympathy for the IRA or any sympathy. On the other hand, my friends included many Catholic people, And when it came to July, the marching season, they didn't come when I was a late teenager, early 20s. They didn't come to the dance halls with me. They were frightened of getting beaten up. Now, that is not right. And they were discriminated against in all kinds of ways, which I found and still find utterly objectionable. So I didn't think that many of the politicians really reflected the reality of the lives of most people, which is that most people in Northern Ireland got on with each other. And then it came to around the summer marching season, and they certainly didn't.
It's really interesting talking to journalists as we have on personality politics. They really, everyone comes at whether to hold political views with a completely different philosophical perspective. So John Humphreys, for example, openly discussed all the different parties he'd voted for throughout his career, always voted, sometimes Labour, sometimes the Tory. Alistair Stewart, the ITN newsreader, said, I made it a point of principle never to vote for 30 years as a journalist. I didn't think it was the right thing to do. Where are you on that scale? Should you hold political views as a hack, or is it your duty not to?
I think it's impossible not to pay attention to the individuals that we, Tom, get to meet and think, you know what, that person's a good person, but is that person a good leader? I'll give you a good example of that. Michael Foot. I really liked Michael Foot. He was an old guy when I met him, and I spent a long time with him, and I really, really, in some ways, I kind of adored him. I thought he was a wonderful brain. I think he'd have made a terrible prime minister. It's possible to be engaged, and it's possible to understand people on a human level, and it's possible to think, I don't think I would vote for you as the person to lead the country. And I still think that. And I still think that about many people in politics. One of the things I do look for, actually, is competence as well as some kind of ideology. My personal views, which don't stick to any particular political party, are coloured undoubtedly by my childhood. So on the one hand, I look at the great things that we do together, the NHS being one, and those great Labour reforms. On the other hand, the reason we moved to Edinburgh was I won a scholarship to a private school. So I was in with the posh boys suddenly, and I have a completely different view, perhaps, of some people from the Labour Party about aspiration and where that will go. Some people on the left of the Labour Party. So I think it's possible to hold, I don't think these two views are contradictory at all. I think it's possible for us to say there are some things as a society we can do better together, health being the obvious one, defence being another, having a police force. And it's also possible to have in your brain that we should make sure that people have the ability, if they have the ability, can rise up no matter what background they're from. Those don't seem to me to be contradictory things. And therefore, for me to say, I'm with the Alistair Stewart kind of view that you shouldn't go around as a journalist saying who you actually vote for. But I can tell you there's some decent people in politics, and there's some other guys as well.
Well, you then went on to join Newsnight. You were at Newsnight for a very long time. You were the lead presenter there for over 10 years until 2014. You interviewed a lot of different politicians. Now, Newsnight has a view among certain Tory establishment figures as being the bastion for sort of urban, London-based centre-left. Was that true when you were there?
I think what I noticed about Newsnight when I started was it did feel a bit like I'd gone into the officer class, you know? They were some of the brightest people I've ever met who had quite a charmed life because they had gone to public school and gone to Oxford, and they went to country houses at the weekends. I didn't do that. So I did feel that. What I do feel now, and I'm glad you kind of framed it in terms of, you know, me being a foreign correspondent for many years. When I came back to Britain from being all over the place, being in every continent except Antarctica, doing reports, every one, I did think it was quite a strange country. And I thought that a much more divided country than I had actually thought about. And I also thought that maybe I'd been in the officer class, you know? I lived in Washington. I had never been to Workington. I have now. I had been to Brussels dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and been to Blackpool, I think 4 or 5 times. And I think I really get that this is a weakness the media in general. It's a weakness in our politics, that we're a very, very diverse country, but sometimes we don't reflect that. And I think what we've seen over the past decade in particular, not just in Scotland with Scottish nationalism, but also with the 3.8 million people who voted for UKIP in 2015, I think a lot of people in journalism didn't get that. And I think I was one of them. And I think those 3.8 million who ended up with one seat in our parliament, Douglas Carswell, who then quit UKIP, have a right to feel very aggrieved. And they were mostly in England. And I think that's one of the things which has coloured our politics. And I do feel very strongly about it, that diversity is not some kind of woke add-on about journalism or politics or anything else. It is a sales pitch for better journalism and for better politics and for a better country.
We'll get to your latter day writings in a bit, because I know you've written a really interesting book about this, but was it really a problem across the media per se? I used to work for The Sun. I don't think they ever failed to represent the view of UKIP voters, maybe, but was it more of a problem with the BBC, the sort of the broadcast London-based establishment than anyone else?
Well, I think it was, if you say the London-based establishment. See, the BBC, I would say to you, has actually one of the most devolved parts of our country. You go to Scotland, and there is a radio for Gaelic speakers. Now, there's very few people who speak Gaelic in Scotland. The same is true in Wales. So in one sense, particularly the three other nations, Northern Ireland is obviously not a nation, but that's a slightly more complicated issue. But there's a great deal of devolution and a great deal of reflection about that. I think it's less true in England. And it's not just less true about the BBC. It's true, for example, The Sun has got a Scottish edition. I don't think you've got a Northwest edition or a Yorkshire edition. And England, in my view, I can say this as somebody who is Scottish born, brought up in Northern Ireland, lives in and loves England. England is underserved. The English people have got a right to say, where is the news that really reflects my life in Norfolk or Lincolnshire or Merseyside? And I know a lot of these areas, Liverpool has a very strong sense of identity, but I'm not sure it's as well served as Scotland or London or elsewhere.
It's fascinating. We'll come back to that, but while you were at Newsnight, you interviewed a lot of very senior political figures. Just tell me who you most enjoyed interviewing from a personal perspective.
Yeah, William Hague. Really interesting. There was some day I was supposed to interview him. I can't remember what the crisis was within the Conservative Party. He was leader, terrible crisis. And I said to my producer, he's going to have to deal with this. He came out and he did the interview. And I said to him afterwards, I was surprised. He said, you've just got to get on with it. I really admired that. Really, really admired it. I really admired David Miliband when he was foreign secretary. And I asked him a question, something to do with the Middle East. Again, this was in Newsnight. Can't remember what the question was, but I remember his answer. He said, I really don't know the answer to that. I really don't know. And I thought, isn't it great that we've got a politician, and I think Hague would be another one who would do the same thing, who can say, I really have to think about it. I'll have to talk to some experts. I really wish that would kind of catch on. Because I think you and I have interviewed a lot of people who go blah, 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 blah about stuff they haven't got a clue about. And one of the things that did, I've avoided becoming politically engaged for years. But I remember when I got involved a couple of years ago with what became Change UK. And the moment I got involved was seeing a tweet from a Conservative MP called Andrew Jenkins, who said it was all about Brexit. It was absolutely not going well. Let's put it that way. And she said, just believe. And I thought, now, wait a minute. I have not come back after years as a foreign correspondent to just believe in some kind of political mumbo jumbo. It's not a religion. And at that point, I thought, I may not be able to do very much, but I think I can do better than that.
Well, let's talk. That's a very sound point. Let's talk about your political involvement then. In 2018, you crossed the line. You decided to come out to play a part in politics. You spoke at various rallies for the People's Vote. You opposed Brexit quite bitterly, and then you, as you say, you ran for Parliament, ran for the European Parliament for Change UK. What made you, having spent a life as an observer, being non-partisan, as you just discussed, what made you cross that line and do something completely different?
Well, when I voted in 2016, I voted against Brexit because I thought nobody knows what this means. I can see why people are angry up and down the country for all the reasons I've given, justifiably, but it's the wrong answer to some of the right questions, which is, what's the point of Britain? Where's our place in the world? What are we trying to do? Who should have some power? But after the vote, I accepted it. You know, that's what you do. I just thought, well, they've won. Let's see where it goes. And it didn't go anywhere. And, you know, 5 years, almost 5 years afterwards, we're still in the same predictable mess. And I started to look at not what we were told Brexit would be like, but what it would actually be like leaving the EU. And the more I looked at it, looked at the facts, and looked at the competence of the people trying to tell us how to do it, and talk to people in the Department of Health who were talking about, will we have to have massive fridges for various drugs if we can't get them in? Talk to people who said, do you know, 99% of all Viagra in Britain comes from Ringaskiddy, County Cork. That will be in the EU. Did you know? And so on and so on and so on. And so I just thought, perhaps it's time to bring some facts into this discussion. And I joined Change UK because it didn't really exist as a political party. I didn't have to then say, as you'd have had to do if you joined the Lib Dems, defend going into government with David Cameron. It didn't have to defend whatever the Conservatives had been standing for years, or the Labour Party. And it was just, I genuinely believe that change is what we need, of a very, very profound sort. And we failed. I mean, we got 117,000 votes in London, but we didn't really make any impact. And it was very interesting as a journalist to face other journalists on the campaign trail and see their great strengths.
Some of your friends as well, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. It was quite.
You say strengths ironically.
British journalism is in a pretty good place, most of it, actually. And, you know, I say all the time, most journalists do not get out of bed in the morning to get things wrong or to make things up. They just don't. And if you did it, you'd be fired, generally. And so the same with politicians. I don't think most politicians get out of bed in the morning to think about how to destroy the country. But I do think that the two-party system in particular means that, well, let me ask you, how do you become Chris Grayling? You become Chris Grayling by being loyal, not by being good at any of the jobs that you do, but by being loyal and to the party. And the same is true of the current government, and the same was true of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. And that is what puts people off politics. It put me off it for years.
Okay. I do have to ask you, though, some might say when journalists, prominent high-profile journalists like yourself, cross the line and run for elected office, it could be seen as undermining the rest of us, because politicians might look at the rest of us and say, well, look, you're all Gavin Eslers, you're secret anti-Brexiteers, secret Remainers, secret socialists, secret right-wingers, whatever it might be. And you really shouldn't have done that because you've made it worse for the rest of us.
Tom, I really hope you said that to Boris Johnson and Michael Gove.
That's a good point. I'm sure someone has at some stage over the years.
I don't think it makes it worse for the rest of us. I do think that how can I put this politely? I do think that the record of journalists who go into politics has not been as good as I would like it to be. And I think that there is a great difference between writing two versions of a story about Brexit for your column when you're Boris Johnson, and actually trying to implement any version of Brexit when you become Prime Minister. It doesn't necessarily, we're all wonderful people, journalists, aren't we? But we do have certain limitations. And I think it's quite good if people with perhaps some more skills were at the very top end of politics.
Okay, let's talk about your book, How Britain Ends. Now, it reads to me, a very good read, but it reads to me as a warning that the United Kingdom is perilously close now to breaking up. First of all, can I assume by that that you think that is a bad thing and you're a unionist to your core?
I have been a unionist all my life, but if it means defending the current way in which the United Kingdom is run, I don't see that that is tenable anymore. So you can take that however you like. Let me put it this way. The United Kingdom has been reinvented every 100 years since 1603. It was reinvented in 1707 with a Union of Parliaments, 1801, 1922 when the Irish left, most of Ireland left. It is desperately in need of reinvention now. And I think the Union may have had its day. And I remember Scots said in 1707 when their Parliament joined the English Parliament, they said it's an end of an old song. I think we're at the end of an old song, and I'm not alone. I think George Osborne thinks that. He wrote a piece about that recently. I think that Gordon Brown thinks that, and we've just got to make the best of it. So I think the status quo, to take one example, 43.6% of voters voted for the current government. They've got a majority of 80. In 2015, UKIP voters got nothing, really. And so it's not just Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, which have got different reasons, including Brexit, for feeling aggrieved, but it is people in England too. So the question is, and the question I pose in the book is Britain or is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland worth saving? And if so, how? And if so, who's actually arguing for it? There are very few credible political figures in British politics, credible political figures.
And is it worth saving?
I think there's many great things about it. And I think that many of the great things about it are already, I use the word federalized. We haven't formalized this because we're British, we don't write constitutions and don't actually write a guide to how to do things. But everything from the NHS is a good example, which works locally. But what we've seen with COVID, which you would think is sort of like a war, and only in the sense that it should be bringing us all together, it hasn't. Scotland's gone its own way, Wales has gone its own way, Northern Ireland's gone its own way, and the big cities of Northern England are often, and London actually, are all saying, Sadiq Khan's saying it, that what the government is doing isn't quite right for us. Now, I think that's potentially healthy. I think it's possible to build on that and to give more devolution, not less. And I do think, where I part company with George Osborne, who he said that he thinks Boris Johnson could go down in history as the worst British Prime Minister ever, the equivalent of Lord North losing the American colonies. And he said at the end of his, and I agree with that, by the way, but what he said at the end of his article was that the only way to stop Scottish independence is not to give the Scots the right to vote. I think that is a very, very silly thing to say, because it's supposed to be a democracy. And the more you say that, the more you make it more likely that the United Kingdom will go separate ways. So I think we should just recognize reality. We should recognize what is and try and figure out what ought to be.
What's interesting about your book as well is that you don't seem to blame the problem that the union is suffering at the moment on necessarily Scottish nationalists or Irish nationalists or Welsh nationalists, but on English nationalism, I should say. And why is that? I mean, why can't the English be nationalists as well as surviving within this union?
They can be, and I'm not alone but I'm not alone in suggesting what you've just mentioned. The way I put it this way is, look, 84% of the population of the United Kingdom is English. Survey after survey has shown that in all parts of the United Kingdom, people, if you meet a stranger, that you're less likely to say, I'm Scottish. You're more likely to say I'm Scottish than to say you're British. You're more likely to say I'm Welsh than to say you're British. And in England is changing too. And many, many people now feel, and they're quite right to do that, to feel that they're more English, partly because the glue of Britishness. I look at the history, as you know Tom, and Linda Colley, the great historian of Britishness, says Britain was founded, the United Kingdom was founded on Protestantism, empire, and war. Now, I hope we don't have a war, but certainly Protestantism and empire are less significant than they were in the past. The glue of Britishness, we have a language where nobody's going anywhere. We share an island or a series of islands. We have so much in common, but we haven't got a political system that is right for the 21st century. And Gordon Brown, who I also agreed with what he was writing this week, suggested that we're on the verge of becoming a failed state, which I think is quite a bold way to put it, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about it.
Gavin, that's been a really interesting conversation. We're coming to the end. I have one final task to do, which is try and sum you up. I have to put you in a little pigeonhole and describe what you are. So I'm going to describe you, a bit of a cop-out, but I'm going to describe you anyway as an impassioned, pragmatic, centrist unionist. Am I right? I've got it all there, you see.
I don't know. I don't know. The only thing I would quarrel with is it depends what the union looks like. I think that is the key question, because I do think that we can't go on with the Westminster-centred, I mean, I don't use Nigel Farage's words lightly here, this idea that we're ruled by a political elite. I think he is onto something. It's not quite right, and he's got the wrong solutions, but I think we've got to do something about that.
Fascinating. You wouldn't disagree with centrism, though. At least I got some of it right.
Well, it's always good to get something right, isn't it?
Gavin, thank you for your time. Gavin Esler, thank you so much for joining us on Personality Politics.
Thanks, Tom.